Hey folks, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented and funded by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning novel and audiobook also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest release, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within Remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the last episode, I covered the opening of Chapter 17, including the secrets of Aerith's old room at Shinra HQ, what exactly the Whispers are, and the most interesting battles in Chadley's combat simulator. This time around, I'll be continuing with Chapter 17, its self-titled Deliverance from Chaos. The video will inherently include spoilers for this section of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 17 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, if you're not familiar with the original Final Fantasy VII, there will very likely be heavy spoilers. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Once the player has had their fill of the combat simulator on level 66, they can progress the plot by boarding the elevator at the end of the corridor. The group is currently confined to the floors of Professor Hojo's laboratory, because Avalanche HQ's bomb has triggered a high security alert in the Shinra building. As the doors to the elevator close, Cloud sees a black feather floating to the ground. This is a callback to Chapter 1, when he saw the same thing at the Mako reactor core. Its intention is likely to evoke thoughts of Sephiroth, but the music in the background is a new version of the track Sign from Advent Children. In the movie, the music plays while Rufus tells Cloud about the Turks' search for Jenova. As it happens, Rufus and Jenova are two characters that are properly introduced in this chapter. It should probably also be noted that Advent Children is the only other entry in the Final Fantasy VII saga where Sephiroth is actually seen with a black wing. The elevator brings the party to the 68th floor, the restricted level of Hojo's lab. Red 13 calls the place Shinra's Dark Secret, which is the same term used to describe deep ground during Dirge of Cerberus. I guess the company does have more than one dark secret. What's intriguing about the location, which is known as the Drum, is that it's new to Remake and occupies 2 whole floors at the summit of Shinra HQ. Based on the massive pipes below, whatever is being stored here requires a huge amount of Mako. As Cloud crosses the bridge to the central construct, it becomes apparent that the tank at its core is housing the headless Jenova specimen. Just like in the original game, Barrett is the first to speak up about the grotesque figure, though Aerith answers him this time, triggering one of Cloud's mental jolts. This also happened to him outside Jenova's container in the old Final Fantasy VII. Cloud has flashes of traumatic memories regarding Sephiroth speaking to Jenova at the Nibelheim reactor, and Tifa crying over the body of her dead father. As I've touched on in previous episodes, these memories do not actually belong to Cloud, because it was Zack who was present for them. It's likely to be apparent by now that memories which are not his are the main reason for Cloud's headaches throughout Remake. Amid the flashbacks, he sees Sephiroth descend from above, then stand before Jenova's tank. However, it is not until Tifa touches Cloud's arm that Sephiroth appears before the others. Exactly who can and cannot see the villain in this moment created some confusion among fans at the time of Remake's release, and some clarity was provided in the secret section of the game's original Ultimania. While multiple iterations of Sephiroth show up in Remake, it has been confirmed that the one on the bridge is a black-robed figure. The reason the group sees Sephiroth and not one of the tattooed clones is down to Jenova's power of illusion and manipulation, and he was previously hidden from everyone but Cloud the same way. Precedent was already set for this in the old Final Fantasy VII, with a perfect example being at the Whirlwind Maze, where the Sephiroth-controlled Jenova repeatedly appears and disappears, takes the form of Tifa, makes the party members invisible to the character holding the black materia, then creates the illusion of a burning Nibelheim. When Cloud momentarily regains his composure, he asks Sephiroth if it's really him, reminding the player that the young man believes his former hero to be dead. Cloud is then overcome by another spasm, but this time he grabs his left bicep, in exactly the same place that his geostigma sores are located in Advent Children. The context here is that geostigma is the body's overreaction to Jenova cells in its system, suggesting the cells in Cloud are concentrated in his left arm, perhaps because that's where they were injected into him. Overcoming the headaches, Cloud charges at Sephiroth, leaping into the air with his sword. Sephiroth catching the force of Cloud's strike on the Masamune and sending him plummeting into the depths of the drum, visually parallels Zack's attack on Sephiroth at the Mount Nebo reactor in Crisis Core. This may be another little nod to the fact that Cloud's memories aren't his. From somewhere in the laboratory, Hojo is watching events unfold. He is thrilled to see his hypothesis proven, though the script doesn't clarify what that hypothesis is. Or does it? Before Sephiroth launches Cloud from the bridge, he remarks that this is a touching reunion. As we learn at the Northern Crater in the original Final Fantasy VII, Hojo's reunion theory was that the cells of Jenova would eventually seek to reassemble. He moved the body of the specimen from Mount Nebo to Shinra HQ, in the hope that the gathering would take place where he could monitor it. Unlike the old game, Cloud facing off against a Sephiroth clone here and now satisfies Hojo's hypothesis about the reunion. Shaking himself down after the fall, Cloud goes in search of his comrades. It's discovered that the entire ground level of the drum is row upon row of test subject pods. Veteran fans may have noticed that these egg-shaped capsules are very reminiscent of the ones that appear in the secret chamber of the Mount Nebo reactor in the old game. The developers were going all out here to create imagery from Cloud's flashback. As I explained in my episode covering the second half of Chapter 13, the pods in the original contained maconoids, which were people exposed to the process of Mako condensation. In the drum though, the capsules are filled with the unknown entities, whose features are very different. When Cloud engages with them, Red 13 joins the fight, though he cannot be controlled by the player. Being able to run around as Red 13 is one of the things I'm personally most looking forward to in the next instalment of Remake. The dynamic duo soon find Barret and begin their search for Tifa and Aerith. It's not long before they are reunited, kind of. The two groups are separated by a force field around one of the lab offices, and the only way they can communicate is via the PHS terminals. To solve the puzzles in this dungeon, the player has to use the phones to alternate between the parties at key points. This is a pretty great Easter egg for fans of the original, because PHS was the way in which the player swapped characters in and out of the main party. And, every now and again, it had a role in the story as a cell phone. According to the Ultimanio Omega, PHS stands for Personal Handy Phone System, so the acronym's use on Remake's clunky communication terminals is slightly inaccurate. A brilliant addition nonetheless. When Cloud first activates the PHS and speaks to Tifa, their conversation is interrupted by Professor Hojo on the drum's loudspeaker. He informs the group that he plans for them to participate in an ambitious experiment of his, which is absolutely in line with his character. But surely he wouldn't put Aerith in harm's way so soon after regaining access to her, right? As the girls make their way out of the office, Tifa asks Aerith whether she thinks Cloud is okay, because he's been acting weirder than usual lately. Aerith responds that he'll be fine, then immediately changes the subject to how Tifa is holding up. This seems to come as a surprise to Tifa, which may be a subtle callback to her chapter in the official novel On the Way to a Smile, where she is often too busy worrying about others to think about herself. Her question regarding Cloud, however, carries a lot of weight. Tifa's observation that he has been acting weird lately is the player's first true indication that she is conscious something really isn't right with her childhood friend. This, of course, is laying the groundwork for her reaction to Cloud's retelling of the events at Nibelheim. In addition, use of the phrase "more than usual" relates specifically to how Tifa remembers him from their youth. Kazushige Nojima's most recent novel, Traces of Two Pasts, reveals that Tifa viewed Cloud as a bit of an oddball in the years after her mother died. Final Fantasy VII is clear that his behaviour was directly linked to being blamed for Tifa's mountainside fall and being in a coma for 7 days, though the book explains that it takes her a while to realise it. What's interesting about this is it establishes that Tifa's default perception of Cloud is that he's a bit weird in general. Another thing worth pointing out here though is that neither Aerith nor Tifa makes any reference to Sephiroth. Given that Sephiroth murdered Tifa's father, almost killed her, and left her with a degree of physical and psychological trauma, his appearance on the bridge and its connection to Cloud's headaches should be ringing all sorts of alarm bells. And that doesn't even touch on what Aerith may or may not know about Sephiroth's future. When Barrett asks what type of research takes place in Hojo's lab, Red 13 provides a brief overview, telling them that the scientist has dedicated half his life to studying Jenova. He says the experiments here relate to the enhancement of both organic life and machines through the use of Jenova's biological data, which itself is extraterrestrial in origin. While the focus of Jenova-based experimentation at Shinra HQ is certainly amplified in Remake, it isn't inconsistent with other titles in the compilation. A variety of creatures can be found in the lab during the original Final Fantasy VII, Before Crisis, and Crisis Core, with the latter game also including a whole side quest plot in the soldier missions about monsters that had escaped Hojo's facility. However, as I spoke about in the last episode of my Chapter 16 breakdown, the connections between Jenova and lifeforms such as Specimen HO512 are now very prominent. An interesting point while we're on the subject is that there are a few enemy types encountered in Chapter 17 that are not found anywhere else in Remake, except the battle simulators, but they do correspond quite nicely to the scenario in the old game. The first of these are the Zenins. These hideous beasts are only fought in Hojo's lab after the Jenova specimen has broken out of its containment, implying that they too have escaped their cages, just as they do in Remake. The enemy intel for Zenin shows that it's a species created by synthesizing parts of other life forms, presumably one of which is Jenova. In the material Ultimania, one of the developers reveals that he was asked to make the Zenin's movements more like those of a monkey, suggesting the monster has a primate element to it. Another enemy that first appears in the old game during Jenova's Trail of Blood sequence at the lab is the Brain Pod. Remake's version is a bit more elaborate though. As if lifted straight out of a horror movie, the masked things that emerge from the brain pods are actually copies of human brains, according to the intel. This makes them ever so slightly more terrifying than the little pink faces that pop out in the old game. The toxins and illusions of the brain pods are perhaps a good example of what Red 13 meant when he said Hojo was using Jenova's biological data to enhance machines. But another example is the sledgeworms, which are autonomous weapons. These guys are known as hammer blasters in the original, and are actually fought prior to entering Hojo's lab. During battles against them in Remake, they are able to retreat, then reappear in their bases, which is described in the enemy intel as their ability to warp space and time. Given the degree of shapeshifting powers possessed by Jenova, I would say sledgeworms represent a fairly successful outcome to Hojo's research. As a side note, in the original game, a testimonial that Ifalna gives to Professor Gast mentions that Jenova decimated the Cetra clans 2000 years ago by infecting them with a virus and turning them into monsters. The official novel The Kids Are Alright contains a slight elaboration on this. In a chapter told from Sung's perspective, he makes reference to Hojo's interpretation of the story, noting that the virus actually caused distrust and paranoia among families, eventually leading to them fighting each other. Sung goes on to speculate that it was the prolonged time Hojo spent around the Jenova specimen and its powers of manipulation that turned the scientist wicked and crazed. When Cloud, Barrett and Red 13 begin to make their way through Ward 2 of the Drum, they are faced with a series of battles in the combat testing areas of the facility. Hojo is conducting these experiments from the control room above each test site, prompting Barrett to fire at him in vain. In response to one of Barrett's taunts, Hojo tells the group that he never grows tired of watching his toys get broken, no matter how many times it happens. This could simply be a literal reference to him finding the combat data of a weapon's defeat to be useful, but his delivery of the line suggests there is a deeper meaning to it. After all, Hojo has lost so many prized soldier assets over the years, such as Genesis, Angel, Zack, and his own biological son, Sephiroth. Speaking of soldier, Barrett later asks if part of the facility is a hospital. It's very possible that some of the soldier enhancements take place in this ward, which, as we know, typically involves increased exposure to Mako and Jenova cell infusion. It's also not too odd a question, because Dirge of Cerberus reveals that Deep Ground started as a medical facility for wounded soldiers. Perhaps future story content from the mobile games The First Soldier and Ever Crisis will expand on this, as the former is set in the same time period as Deep Ground's creation. It's eventually revealed that the life form Hojo was most eager to test against Cloud and the others is the Sordipede. Like opponents such as Hellhouse and Eligor before it, Swordipede is simply a standard, albeit bizarre, enemy from the original Final Fantasy VII that has been promoted to boss level. It was actually called Sword Dance in the old game, and, despite the extent of its weirdness, is never encountered in Hojo's lab. And finally, having gathered all the data he requires, Hojo decides it is time to let the party leave the drum. As he makes the elevator accessible again, he spots movement on one of his monitors, and cackles with delight to see the robed figure, still in the guise of Sephiroth, carrying the Jenova specimen away from its tank. Again, this is a significant deviation from the original, where Jenova itself burst from its confinement, then later adopted Sephiroth's form. The group realise something is wrong as soon as they return to the 68th floor. All that remains of the tank's contents is some glowing organic material at its base, and the detached metal crown that had been connected to the stump of Jenova's neck. The trail of blood, so iconic and horrifying in the old Final Fantasy VII, has now been given a twist. Where red smears of gore coated the floors of Hojo's labs before, globules of purple alien blood bubble on the walkways here. It's unclear if the colour was changed due to strict censorship rules in some countries, but the official name for this part of the scenario in Remake is the Crimson Trail, suggesting the use of purple wasn't the initial plan for developers. I've highlighted a few times across this series that there's an association in Remake between the colour purple and Sephiroth. The connections there are something that was popularised online by my friend and YouTube essayist Sleepeasy. However, as our fellow content creator Ray Kaufman has pointed out, the origin of that association may be the colour of Jenova's blood, as we see here, which can also be found in the organic material that cocooned the specimen in the old game. I expect that as the remake progresses, we are going to see these links deepen even further. Well everyone, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from the drum section of Chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim Incident, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, or mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as an audiobook and special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon, the address for which is noted at the end of this video. I would additionally like to thank KupoCon for commissioning this series, and encourage all viewers to support their channel and brand. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.